the idea that religion causes conflict or fundamentalism causes conflict, I think an answer to that question requires a rethinking about what it is when we talk about religion.
So if you put yourself in someone else's shoes and you think, why are they believing this and why are they acting like this, it helps you to understand, and then it helps you to resolve problems better.
But I thought all the issues were pretty well aired in the discussion with the panel we had, and by the way, I thought the panel themselves were extremely articulate.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a very great pleasure to welcome you to what's going to be a very interesting debate on the topic of how can religious moderates deal better with uncompromising hardliners and the conflicts they cause. Charles, would you like to introduce our topic?
The modern media world works in a way throughout the world which tends to give greater authority to people who are more dramatic in what they have to say, perhaps more challenging in what they have to say. And sometimes that can mean that the overall role of the religion is misunderstood by a wider public when one's discussing big and problematic issues. And we think that the way media and public attention has focused on religion often leads to a misunderstanding of the nature of religion and their beliefs and practices by millions of people who watch that discussion taking place. The issue of how religion is seen, its impact in society, its impact on particular questions, is a very important one. And if people generally get false views of what religions believe, how they practice, what they do, that can lead to possible responses which are not proportionate and not accurate and not helpful. And so we think getting a real understanding of how to deal with these questions is a very important issue.
So it's my very great pleasure to begin by welcoming Masouda Bano. Masouda comes from the University of Oxford. She works in development studies in the Department of International Development there. She has done absolutely fantastic work looking at leadership, at authority, and in particular at women's leadership in Islam.
I like to argue that it's to assume that somebody is a religious hardliner would mean that he or she will necessarily have a propensity for conflict or violence. Is not necessarily a very legitimate assumption to begin with. When you see religious violence, religious belief turn into any kind of rigidity and conflict, especially armed conflict, it's a lot to do with the context. And because repeatedly when I do interview with these people who join jihadi groups, it's not religion that you can pin down as the motivating force. What you pin down repeatedly is a strong sense of injustice they feel, and add to that the dimension that they feel there's no normal way to vent, to seek justice for that cause. Where religion comes into play, according to my research, is that it helps make that sacrifice. If you go for jihad, you risk your life. So why do it for the other? If you're a rational believer, why do it for others? Why risk your life? Religion promises that other worldly rewards, which make that sacrifice, personally rewarding. So that's how I'll explain that. Secondly, a related argument I'll form is that if you look at extreme form of conflict, which is religious like this violence and jihad or sectarian violence, I'm very convinced based on my research that it cannot sustain in the long term, like the phenomena like Taliban, unless states are involved. I'm 100% convinced of that. Just because these groups cannot survive, the kind of support they need, the mobilization they need, it cannot happen without state support. And it could be at times global strategic interest, as we saw in case of Afghanistan war and the Soviet conflict. But increasingly, it's about the domestic context, because a lot of Muslim countries are under military rule, and it serves very well for these military rulers to show to the West that here are the Islamists, if you don't have us, they'll take over. So do you understand? So I would argue that it's not religion per se that leads to conflict, it's the use of it by actors that leads to it.
Thank you very much. Now Peter Heriot is going to speak to us. Peter is a social psychologist, and he has written many very, very illuminating and wonderful books about fundamentalism from that point of view. Particularly Christian fundamentalism in various parts of the world.
Every social system is somewhere along a continuum. And the extreme points on that continuum are, at the one end, integration with other social systems, and at the other end, differentiation from them. And fundamentalist movements are very, very much at the differentiated end of that continuum. They really, really need and want to be different. And you can tell this from the way in which the first people they say they're different from are people from their own religion, because they're the people they might most be confused with. So why are they so concerned to be different? What is the purpose of difference from their own perspective? The first purpose I'd like to suggest is that they can thereby set up a context for conflict. That is, the more different you are, then the easier it is to treat others in terms of stereotypes. You can then set up an us versus them situation, an opportunity for conflict, which is their raison d'etre, their reason for existence, what they really need. If my group to whom I belong succeed, it is I who succeed. If they're persecuted, it is I who suffer. So that's a very powerful way of motivating the troops. It gives them, first of all, self-identity. God has chosen me uniquely. I'm one of a chosen few. Secondly, it gives me a meaning in the sense that I know what the world's about. It's a cosmic conflict, and I know where I stand in it. What might be the logical implications of that theoretical analysis? The first I'd like to suggest is a pretty negative one. That is, we should avoid painting ourselves into a role of enemy, of, above all, an enemy who persecutes. Because as soon as we provide them with that role, then they can take on the role of victim, which is a really, really powerful role for them to have, and does all sorts of good, both for their cause and for motivating their troops. It's really not much use inviting them round for tea and a nice chat. And the reason for this is that technically that's the contact hypothesis. In other words, if only we were to get face-to-face with each other, then we could solve our problems. But actually, the very existence of stereotypes makes that an unlikely achievement to succeed. Conflict is not only fundamentalists' way of perceiving the world and acting in it, it's also the way that much media, both traditional and social media, it's also the way in which they perceive the world and present it.
Peter, thank you very, very much indeed. A very interesting framework. Thank you. Our third panellist is Sir Tony Baldry, who's been the Conservative Member of Parliament for North Oxfordshire for 30 years, I think, Tony. He served in the government from 90 to 97 with a number of ministerial posts, including a ministerial post at the Foreign Office, and he's had a very substantial experience in international development and foreign affairs, chairing the Select Committee on International Development from 2001 to 2005.
Within a single religious group, there are and can be very wide variations. Do people go to a particular church because overall it feels its type of worship, its welcome, its ambience speaks to their condition? And do they then accept the theology of that particular brand, or does the theology come first? So the practice of religion by humans, one could argue, is a curious experience, and is usually simultaneously both, deeply personal. We are expressing our own personal religious beliefs, but yet at the same time an activity carried out collectively with others. It's both personal and collective at the same time. And in England, I think the collective memory of the atrocities of the Reformation, Counter-Reformation and post-Counter-Reformation church, with associated torture, mayhem, murder and martyrs, have inclined us to be a society of the widest possible religious tolerance, or as Queen Elizabeth I put it, we should not build windows into men's souls. Occasionally, as with the recent debate on women bishops, it is necessary to broker a consensus between various groups. What is the theology on which they are unwilling to compromise, and what are the matters of condition and practice on which they can compromise, particularly if they themselves are not going to be obliged to make fundamental changes in how they worship or alter what speaks unto their condition.
Majid Nawaz is our fourth speaker, and we're delighted that you are here today. He is co-founder and chairman of Quilliam, which, as you probably mostly know, is a globally active think tank focusing on matters of integration, citizenship and identity, religious freedom, extremism and immigration, and co-founder of Khudi, a Pakistan-based social movement campaigning to entrench democratic culture amongst the nation's youth. And his work is informed by years spent in his youth as a leadership member of a global Islamist group and his gradual transformation towards liberal democratic values.
Actually, Islam isn't a religion of war or peace, it's just a religion. And like all other religions and any other religion, it's interpreted. So with that in mind, just to back up the point that my colleague Masuda made at the start, what are the terms I want to clarify? Today we're dealing with the twin challenges of interpretation within the Islamic context that are leading to certain problems across the world. And the first is fundamentalism. And fundamentalism could be, well, I'll refer it to here as a rigid, dogmatic desire to adhere to one true version of Islam in the person who's claiming so. Now, I don't mean conservative religious practice. So when I talk about fundamentalism, I'm not talking about the Muslim man who grows a beard or a Muslim woman who covers her hair. I'm actually not even talking about a Muslim woman who covers her face, though I disagree personally with that practice and don't think it's mandated by the religion. I'm talking about somebody who dehumanizes others for not doing so. That's what I mean by fundamentalism. What's the other twin challenge? The other one is what I refer to as Islamism. Now, some of you may think they're the same thing, and that's why I'm clarifying these points. So what is Islamism? In a brief sentence, Islamism is the desire to impose any given interpretation of the faith over society, which is different to fundamentalism. Now, when I say the desire to impose any given interpretation over the society, that can be by law, it can be by force. And you have different types of Islamists, those who are violent and those who are political. So those are the twin challenges we're facing. The vast majority of Muslims belong to neither category. The vast majority of Muslims, in fact, do not actively identify as Muslims with public life. As we know, the voice of the organized minority comes to dominate the discourse of the disorganized majority. What we mustn't do is assume or cede the terms of engagement to the fundamentalists or to the Islamists. In other words, surrender the religion to them. So bin Laden was engaged in jihad, we're engaged in freedom. When you surrender those terms, or to say that the fundamentalists are religious and we're not religious, when you surrender the terms of engagement, you disempower the moderate voices. And there's a recent example of that, which has just happened, that I'm quite upset about. And I'll conclude with this. And that recent example is the case of the Law Society recommending what they called Sharia family law. My problem is that it's incredibly patronizing for the Law Society to decide what the Sharia law is when Muslims can't even agree on that. There is no one Islam, there is no the Muslim community, there is no the Sharia, and therefore the Law Society certainly shouldn't be advising as to what that is.
I think that was really successful at putting all the cards on the table. I mean, all the issues that we need to think about in this. But there are some very clear disagreements between you. So let's just start to disentangle them before we start thinking about solutions to the takeover business. Now, one of them is about whether religion causes conflict or not.
If I can give you a response to that, my view would be that a lot of it is triggered, even in terms of timing, by the proxy wars of the states. But then, in my own study of this, any kind of religious militancy, what you see is grievance builds over time too. So the people, the Sunnis who might lose a father or a son in the conflict, might get very personally mobilized in the long term. So do you understand? It's the spillover effect of state-engineered conflict at times, which can then have a much more long-term organic, it can survive just because a lot of personal grievances do develop.
I mean, actually, the scenario you're presenting seems even more depressing than I'd thought. So all the factors that are leading to what Peter would call differentiation are getting ramped up. The resentments are building, states are using religion as proxy, and as you said very well, both Charles and Majid, the media thrives off this and builds it in. So the question is, how do what you call the disorganised majority, how does a disorganised majority, which is the majority, intervene into this situation more effectively?
I still believe in the power of rational argument and rational discussion. If we lose that belief, then we do, as has been said, we cede the whole of the argument to the extremists of whatever context, and we are lost, really.
Peter?
I think that one way of looking at this is to construe fundamentalisms in terms of costs. They are costs in the sense of opportunity costs, that for as long as we have to spend our time busily listening to fundamentalists and trying to cope with them, then the great opportunities that religion has to actually help save humankind from our folly and our greed, those opportunities which will necessarily involve collaborating between religion and science and the other great social systems of the world, fundamentalisms are preventing that sort of collaboration, which is what religion has a tremendous amount to offer for.
We need a cultural shift that basically involves ideas and rational thought, but also narratives. I mean by that kind of, propaganda that sells those ideas. It needs leaders, voices that come forward, that champion those ideas. And
religious
narratives.
moderate ideas.
The sort of the liberalism with a small L, tolerance and peace, love and harmony. And we need iconography. We need symbols. So when you have, that's how you form a cultural shift. You have all of that. You involve music, you involve the arts, you involve culture, and because it's not just about rational thought, because of course you've got to make it appealing, and how you make it popular for a new generation of young people to come forward, and even if they haven't read the details of the books, but they've subscribed to, they've jumped on board with something that's a direction, it's a zeitgeist, and that's what we need.
These Westminster Faith debates, Linda in particular, commissioned a very large YouGov poll about how the different members of the different religions actually believe on contemporary issues. And what was striking about that was the dislocation between what the leadership of some of the faiths and what the people who were of the faith thought was really quite different.
We constructed a very complex scale for measuring how much fundamentalist belief there is in this country. And we were measuring people who hold illiberal moral views and the kind of certain truth commitment, being very, very clear in that, metaphysical views. And in total, what percentage of the population in Britain fits in that category? 3.6%. That would surprise many people because the voice sounds a lot louder than that.
I come across a lot of women who want to be divorced or married according to their faith. And where would they find recourse if they are not happy with what has happened to them? How would you suggest they deal with it if you want to get rid of Sharia courts? And what is your definition of Sharia court?
So in answer to your question, if a Muslim woman, a conservative Muslim woman, wants to refer a private dispute that she has with her husband to a Muslim imam and asks for a conservative Sharia judgment, I use the word conservative as the adjective because of course Sharia isn't one thing, and asks for a Sunni conservative Sharia judgment, she has absolutely every right to seek recourse in that way, right? Because it's voluntary arbitration. What I was talking about was an attempt to canonize and standardize and then popularize that through the Law Society. It's a very different thing.
I can bet on it, you do a survey today about some basic, very controversial things related to women. I'll tell you, men having right to have 4 wives, different inheritance, and majority of the Muslim women will opt for the conservative interpretation. Are you saying they're all fundamentalists? I don't think so.
In
do you
Europe?
understand?
In Europe?
I'm saying Muslim majority countries. What I'm saying is, I don't know about Europe. Maybe the context you're talking is different. So what I'm saying is, Islam is not that open to interpretation as you are suggesting. There are certain core things which majority of the Muslims agree, and I see that point, that in the society, women will be arguing for that. So it gets very problematic. You're presenting Islam
there are
much
so many
more
people who
open.
want to ask a question. Very quickly.
I just need to answer. That the majority of people may say that, I concede. I'm saying that the majority is saying something doesn't mean that's the only interpretation of the religion.
That's fine. I agree.
Okay.
The opt-outs for equality legislation. The fact that privileges have been granted to religious groups on the basis of effective lobbying by that 3 and 5% have led to a situation in which this country is, for all intents and purposes, if not already a theocracy, heading in that direction. And I am appalled at that prospect. I'm a Christian. I do not wish to live in a theocracy, whether it be an Islamic one, a Judaic one, or a Christian one. And I look to politicians to undo the damage of the past few years of having given all these concessions and privileges to religious fundamentalists.
I think it's perfectly reasonable for Parliament to try and moderate proposals and laws to seek to accommodate, so far as is possible, conscience. So, majority of Parliament clearly thought it appropriate to introduce same-sex marriage into the UK. But there are a number of faith groups which clearly believe that marriage is a union between...
But the leaders did, but not the people within them.
Well, I think if you asked any member of Parliament, the post bags that most of us received... There was
My surveys, Tony, showed something different.
Well, I'll share my post bag with you, okay? And I think it was perfectly reasonable...
It's not a scientific sample.
And I think it was perfectly reasonable for Parliament to seek to accommodate those religious views, which as we did.
I just want to pick up on the point about when the Archbishop of Canterbury speaks up about an institution like Wonga, and I think that's creditable and very good. But don't the panel think it's much more powerful, as happened in Liverpool in the 1980s with Archbishop Warlock and Bishop Shepherd, when different faiths get together and jointly condemn things that are wrong in our society?
If we agree that fundamentalists are in the minority, what is it about our society that makes them so obsessed, that makes us so obsessed with them?
In late modern and postmodern societies, we tend to have our personal identity, the unique individual we are, as being the centre of our notion of who we are. Whereas fundamentalists, the centre of their being is what I belong to. It's the movement internalized. It's a social identity. That's very countercultural. And I think, actually, we find it very hard to understand and cope with people who have a social identity as the core of their being.
I think it really is important to try and disentangle the role of religion and the role of social, political, economic, state, national factors. The second thing, at the risk of sounding very liberal with a small L, I emphasise in the situation, is that I do think this point about dialogue is unbelievably important. And I think the kind of long-term path has got to be to encourage this kind of discussion in an open way, both within faiths and between faiths, and to get a commitment to the kind of talking and listening to what others are saying and how they're saying it, between faith leaders, between people who are members of faiths. And that really is the only way forward. But actually, it's not done very much, and we need to do it a lot more. And that's the main conclusion I draw from the conversation we've had this evening.